Alrighty, so here is my ED304 terms concept map. We'll go ahead and start with my first little branch here, which is the psychomotor domain. So the psychomotor domain has to do with how our bodies function mechanically, and that has a lot to do with our frontal and our motor cortex. There's a lot of other things, obviously, that are involved in the way that our bodies function, but in terms of this class, I'm just going to talk about these two cortexes. So one really important function that we covered in the beginning of the class that will specifically relate to how we teach is memory. And this is based a lot on our neural efficiency and the plasticity of, especially of our students and stuff like that. So we've got different types of memory. Oh, this is in the wrong place. So we've got emotional memory, declarative memory, and working memory, and sensory memory. And all of these memories, or all of these functions, are how we remember things, and they each serve different purposes. The corpus callosum has to do with how each side of our brain communicates with each other, and that can actually aid in memory. So another thing that I wanted to bring up was the primacy-recency effect. That actually has to do with how effectively students remember things, and they tend to remember the things that they learned the most recently. So yeah, we'll go ahead and move on to the affective domain. This has to do with adolescence. This has to do with the limbic system, and the limbic system has a lot to do with the way that we emotionally respond to things. To things that we learn and we interact with every single day. The limbic system governs how we react emotionally and how we encode information based on emotion. And so with all these different parts of the limbic system, the thalamus, the hypothalamus, the amygdala, and the hippocampus, we remember things differently based on emotion. And these all govern those emotions and the hormones that come along with that. So another part of the affective domain I wanted to cover would be gender. Different genders tend to react differently to different stimuli, and these reactions tend to be more emotional. One example of this would be ADHD and ADD. So these are learning disorders that are often associated with men, or at least they're more prevalent in young boys and young teen boys, because it has to do with the way that they learn. So it's more prevalent in males. It causes a decline in academic performance, often overdiagnosed, because boys actually do better in school when they are engaged differently in the classroom from their female counterparts. So boys actually learn better when they're sitting closer to the teacher and when when the teacher is louder. And so these boys that don't learn as well, that are sitting in the back, actually get sent to the office way more because the teachers just assume that they're not learning very well, and so they have ADHD because they're not paying attention and they're not getting good grades. When in reality, it's just because they can't hear, they can't learn, because they're not engaged, or they're not interested. And so as a direct implication for teachers, we can really emphasize that and try to help them understand better and move them forward in the classroom, so they are closer to us so they can hear. So there's that. ADHD does affect some women and some girls, but it's more prevalent in boys. So next we have ephibophobia that I wanted to talk about, and that is the fear of teenagers. Teachers who experience ephibophobia are not fit to teach adolescents. That's just the short of it, the long and the short of it. It can be combated or changed with good research rather than a reliance on stereotypes. And there are two different kinds. Well, there's many kinds of research, but for the purposes of this assignment, I want to talk about quantitative and qualitative research. Together, somewhere in the middle of these two is actually the most effective research to do, in order to find the best kind of information based on adolescents, or the best kind of information regarding adolescents and the way that they learn. So next we'll move on to hormones. So hormones they play a huge role in adolescent development, and a lot of other things can kind of spin off from hormones and changes in these hormones, including anxiety disorders and eating disorders. So I wanted to talk about anxiety. So we have different kinds of anxiety. We've got state anxiety and trait anxiety. State anxiety is just anxiety that's felt in the moment. Trait anxiety is anxiety that happens based on genetics, and it's recurring. It doesn't just go away most of the time. And a lot of these anxiety disorders kind of they stem from hormonal changes. So as teachers, we need to be more conscious of the other two types, which would be facilitating anxiety and debilitating anxiety, and these two are actually opposites. Facilitating anxiety is anxiety that we can actually use. It's kind of a motivating factor in students. The more motivated they are to do better and to gain more knowledge and to get better grades, they'll do better because they will have that eustress rather than distress, as far as being motivated to get it done. Debilitating anxiety, however, is the kind of anxiety that you can't really do anything about. It has to do with the way that they react to the situation, the students, how they react. And for some students, certain situations can stress them out to the point where they cannot function. And so as teachers, we need to be aware of this, so that we don't stress our students out too much, or if it does happen that way, that we can react appropriately and help them out and make the situation less stressful. A good example would be test anxiety. There's a lot of students who suffer from test anxiety, and they're smart kids, but as soon as you put a test in front of them and you time them, they cannot take the test because they are too stressed out. And so being able to be aware of that and understanding that we can help them to realize and overcome that, then we can help them do better in school. So another part of this hormonal change comes from this all comes from puberty, but hormones specifically can affect eating disorders and body dissatisfaction, as well as self-esteem. And that actually stems from anxiety. Young women especially, as they go through puberty, they gain more body fat, and so they actually become they can get more stressed out about the fact that they're not as skinny as their male counterparts or as their other female counterparts who have different genetics or anything like that. And so there's a huge problem with eating disorders and stuff in adolescent behavior and adolescents in schools at this point, because they just don't know how to react, or they don't understand why their bodies are changing. And so there's a lot of issues with that. And as teachers, we need to be aware so that if we find students that are experiencing issues like eating disorders and dissatisfaction with their bodies or with their surroundings, that we will be aware of what they're going through and understand what they're going through so we can better help them. Eating disorders are very serious, and if we see a student who seems to be suffering from an eating disorder, to just be aware and to keep an eye out and talk to their parents, talk to counselors and stuff like that to help them kind of overcome that. Something else that kind of stems from that would, of course, be adolescent risk-taking and adolescent mortality. We would also talk about this a little bit later as we talk about social redefinition and stuff like that. Because as they are experiencing more and more peer pressure, and they want to experience more of their life, and so they're pushing boundaries. They're taking a lot of risks that they probably shouldn't be, and it leads to adolescent mortality, which is another serious issue that can affect their life, obviously. So there's that. With this adolescence and puberty comes a lot of changes in cognition, and that kind of leads us to our next branch, which is the cognitive domain. So the cognitive domain just has to do with the way that adolescents think and the way that they interact with their environment based on what they believe, which is their cognitive belief system, or how they identify themselves. So when it comes to puberty, they go through a social cognition and psychosocial development. And so they start to change how they view themselves, their identity, and how they view the world, and they redefine who they are. In some ways, this is a good thing. Maybe they start learning more, they start thinking about their own thinking, and they start thinking about themselves in their world and how they interact with it, which is their theory of mind. Unfortunately, there's also a lot of anxiety that can come with this change, and so they start thinking more about others, and when this happens, they start to kind of believe in this imaginary audience. Some of them do. They start believing in this this audience that somehow seems to be following them everywhere and judging everything they do, and that can cause a lot of anxiety, especially in these young teens, and even adults. I know of adults that are still struggling with this. They believe that everyone's watching them and judging everything they do, and so they base their actions on that. which is actually a problem because it inhibits their learning. At least in adolescence, it inhibits their learning pretty bad, because they're more worried about what's happening in their environment rather than what they're learning. Then they have this personal fable where they believe something that isn't quite reality, but it's based on what they have learned or what they perceive. So something that comes with these changes in cognition is this theory that William Perry has come up with. It's called the theory of cognitive development that he has developed. And it comes with 4 stages, and there are smaller stages within these stages, but for the purposes of this assignment, and for the purposes of just simplicity, we're just going to talk about these. So we have the first stage, which is duality, and that is where the student believes everything is black and white. There are right or there are wrong answers. There isn't really a gray area, and when they ask questions and when they learn in the learning environment, they are learning things based on what's right and what is wrong. So in the next stage, we have the multiplicity stage, which is where everything is suddenly an opinion rather than a fact. And so we have there's actually anxiety that comes in with this stage as well, and this would be early to middle adolescence, normally anyway. And they're starting to regard everything they learn, everything they thought they knew as opinion or as an alternate reality rather than fact. And so it can be good, but it can be detrimental, especially if students and if these young learners don't quite understand what's going on. Then this can be a place where they start doing more and more risk taking. The next stage would be the contextual relativity, and that is where the morality is relative, and it's relative to what they personally think. And so they start making their own decisions based on that, which actually takes us into the commitment within relativism, where they start making their own decisions and determining what is right and what is wrong based on what they personally believe. So that's Perry's theory of cognitive development. And then as they get older, they go through the stage of metacognition, which usually I would say comes within the last 2 stages of the contextual relativity or the commitment within relativism. That's kind of where they start thinking about it more and more, because they gain this new level of cognition where they can actually start thinking about themselves in a sense that isn't a selfish sense, but how they think and how they learn and how they act, and how it can affect other people. So the next stage the next branch I wanted to talk about would be the implications for teachers. And so we have these different kinds of learning, different theories of learning. We have constructivism, behaviorism, connectivism, and cognitivism. And each of these is different. And they're all theories. I think they're all, in their own way, they are all correct. But I think they're all different too. They're different based on how kids learn. Just like kids, they all have their own they all have different ways of learning. And so I think these can all be applicable to different people or different students who learn differently. One I wanted to point out specifically was behaviorism, and that is just the theory that a behavior is learned after a stimulus and a response, and after a learned response from a stimulus. An example of that would be Pavlov's dog. Eventually, Pavlov, he rang a bell, and every time that he rang the bell, he gave his dog a piece of meat. And after a while, he did it over and over. After a while, the dog learned that every time he heard the bell, he would get the piece of meat. And so some students will gain an understanding of, or gain a perspective of their learning environments after it's been learned for a while. A child who comes to school and is told that they are not smart, or that they're not good at school, is going to learn eventually that they are dumb. And so as teachers, we need to be able to realize and recognize that we have the ability to change that if we help to change the response. And so anyway, and there are many other different kinds of examples that we could place there. So that's my my concept map for this class. Thanks so much, Brother Chandler. It's been a really interesting semester. And I hope I get to use this in my career later on. So thank you.